Redditor 1. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family because I always felt it wasn't truly mine to share. It belonged to my father first. But as time has gone by and I've found myself replaying every odd detail in my head, I realized I couldn't keep it tucked away forever. My father himself was never shy about it, though he wasn't one to volunteer the tale to just anyone either. I guess he always figured that people either believed you or they didn't, and there wasn't much point in trying to argue. And to be honest, I've got no proof any of it ever happened. All I can say is that my dad was never one to lie, especially not to me. He had nothing to gain from weaving some elaborate hoax, and the details have been consistent from the time I was old enough to understand words until now, when I'm well into my 20s. So, believe me or don't, but it's burned into my mind all the same. My father grew up in rural Illinois, in a town so small you could drive past it in a heartbeat if you weren't paying attention. Back in those days, he said, life was simple. People left their doors unlocked, kids ran around barefoot in the summers, and the nearest neighbor was still a good half-mile away. Across from their land was a big patch of forest that seemed to stretch on forever, a green tangle of old trees and winding dirt paths. The house itself was a bit worn down, a simple one-level ranch with a battered porch where my grandfather liked to sit in the evenings. The way Dad described it, there was always a hush over the fields at night, broken only by a few chirping crickets or the low rumble of a distant tractor. But there was also something else. He said that sometimes, maybe once a week, or once a month, if you believed Grandpa's stories, you'd see lights dancing above the tree line. They moved too quickly and with too many odd directions to be planes. They were silent, mesmerizing, like someone had pinned laser pointers against the sky. My father and my grandpa treated these sightings like an odd curiosity, not quite daily routine, but not an anomaly either. They'd sit out there after sunset, sipping lemonade or iced tea, and watch these star-like points dart around. He said it was such a common sight that if company came by, Grandpa might even say, "Stick around, you'll see it if you're lucky." Whenever I think about that, I get goosebumps. UFOs, or orbs, or whatever you want to call them. Just the normal backdrop of his childhood. Sometimes, my dad recounted other strange things too. Isolated earthquakes that would rattle the house for a few seconds, but apparently didn't register anywhere else in the county. Bright orbs floating low among the trees, and rumors in the area about silent black aircraft drifting overhead. He swore up and down that each time these weird events happened, he felt a hum in his bones, like a vibration under the earth. He'd feel it in his feet when he stood outside, a faint pulse that rattled his nerves. Nothing ever directly harmed him, and by his teenage years, he'd grown used to the bizarre unpredictability of living in that quiet pocket of Illinois. But there was one story that put all the others to shame, one that always made him clench his jaw and narrow his eyes when he told it. It happened when he was about 15 years old. He was home alone one afternoon, hanging around in the driveway, maybe kicking at rocks or fiddling with some chores while waiting for his parents to return from a shopping trip. The day was hot enough that sweat dripped down his back. The trees were still, the horizon shimmering with heat waves. He said even the songbirds were quiet, as though something had sucked the noise out of the world. That's when a long, black car appeared at the far end of the dirt road and slowly made its way up to the house. He noticed immediately how silent it was. No engine sound, no crunch of gravel, no sense of effort from the motor. It just glided up the driveway. It was sleek, tinted windows, not a single mark or scratch. When it finally stopped a few yards from my dad, the driver's door opened and out stepped a man. Even calling him a man feels wrong. Dad always said he looked too flawless to be real. He was very tall, with pale, smooth skin, light blonde hair parted neatly, and a black suit that looked absurdly well-tailored for a humid Illinois summer day. His expression was a curious sort of childlike smile, like someone seeing color for the first time. At first, Dad was more puzzled than afraid. He'd never seen this person in town, or anywhere for that matter. The stranger's shoes didn't stir up a speck of dust on the driveway. He walked right up to my dad and asked for his name, voice carrying a friendly, almost sing-song quality. Dad asked him why he wanted to know, but the man only said he had a few questions and that he meant no harm. The grin on his face stayed, unblinking. My dad, though he was a pretty down-to-earth kid, felt this gnawing sense that something was off. It wasn't just the man's overdressed appearance or his unseasonal attire. There was an underlying wrongness in his eyes, an excitement that didn't fit the normal rhythms of conversation. The man kept pressing gently. Had Dad seen anything unusual around here? Heard anything? Felt anything? I can imagine the creeping unease building in my father's chest. He told the man, sure, sometimes weird things happened. Lights in the sky, small quakes that shook the property. But Dad was still trying to figure out who this stranger was and why he seemed so desperately eager. And then, mid-sentence, the man's demeanor shifted. The smile vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. He went from cheerful to apprehensive in an instant. Without saying goodbye or offering an explanation, he pivoted, returned to the driver's seat of that black car, closed the door, and sped away, still without making a sound. My dad stood in the driveway, heart hammering, having no clue what had just happened. Minutes later, my grandparents returned from their errands, clueless that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. What's really strange is that this wasn't the end of it. My father finished out his teenage years in that house, watched a few more of those unexplained lights dance around, and eventually moved on to college and adult life. But decades later, 30 whole years at least, my mom was the one who stumbled on something even more unsettling. She was in a bookstore one afternoon, flipping through some magazines, when she sensed someone staring in her direction. She glanced up and spotted two men sitting in the small cafe area near the windows. She said it was as if time froze for her. One of the men was tall, blonde, and unnaturally perfect looking, dressed in a black suit despite the fact that it was a casual bookstore on a mild autumn day. The other guy was dressed the same way, both of them overly neat, both unwrinkled. Her immediate thought was that it had to be the man my dad described, the one from the story he'd told her countless times. The moment she locked eyes with him, she felt a wave of dizziness, like her brain was screaming, "No way, it can't be him." But the more she looked, the more certain she became. And just as Dad described, the blond man's expression changed in a blink. He'd been wearing a mild, polite smile while skimming a newspaper, but once he noticed my mom watching him, he stiffened. Then he shot a glance at the other man, and with no further warning, both of them stood and strode out of the bookstore. She said they moved with eerie synchronicity, as if they'd rehearsed every motion. A moment later, they vanished into a side street. My mom was left standing there, heartbeat pounding in her ears, a half-read magazine in her hands, feeling as if she'd crossed some invisible line. She told me later that she was half tempted to run after them, try to get a license plate, a photograph, anything. But fear rooted her to the spot. She didn't know if she'd just stumbled into some bizarre cosmic joke or witnessed something bigger than any rational explanation. When she got home that evening, she told my dad what happened. He went silent, listening carefully, and finally murmured something like, "Yeah, that's him. That's exactly him." They swapped details. The whiteness of his skin, the perfect suit, the unnatural way he stood and moved, the immediate shift from calm to alarmed. Dad's memories flooded back, and for a few weeks, they slept with the windows locked and the curtains drawn. I was too young at the time to understand the depth of their anxiety, but I do recall the tension in the house. The phone would ring, and they'd share a nervous glance before answering. The porch light would flicker at night, and Dad would step outside to check on it, scanning the driveway as if expecting a silent black car to materialize again. Now, I'm the one who's grown up, and that sense of the unknown has sort of passed on to me. I've never personally encountered this figure, at least not yet. But sometimes, especially when I'm traveling or out doing errands, I catch myself scanning the crowd for a glimpse of a flawless blonde man in a black suit. I wonder if I'd have the courage to walk up to him, or if I'd end up frozen the way Dad and Mom did. Part of me tries to rationalize it, thinking maybe it's just some freaky coincidence, or my dad's memory took on mythic proportions over the years. But then I think of all the other weirdness that always seemed to hover around my family. The lights, the phantom quakes, the orbs. It's like we've been living in the shadow of something we can't name. I've done my share of reading about so-called men in black, UFO watchers, and government agents who show up to ask cryptic questions. But usually, those stories involve intimidation, threats, warnings not to talk. This was something else, some bizarre blend of naive curiosity and then sudden retreat. as if whatever that man was, or whoever he worked for, couldn't quite manage the social niceties of normal human contact. Or maybe he wasn't so naive after all, and he was just trying to play a part. Either possibility makes my skin crawl. Every so often, I bring it up to my dad and ask if he regrets not pressing for answers, if maybe he should have demanded to see identification or asked directly what the man wanted. Dad just shakes his head and says that there was something in that moment that told him not to push. A primal sense of self-preservation, perhaps. The same way you don't poke a sleeping bear or corner a stray dog. And maybe that was for the best. Who knows what might have happened if Dad had tried to keep him there, or asked one question too many. All I know is that these stories have a gravity to them, something you can't brush off as idle tales. My father was never a dramatist. He never sought fame or money, or any of the usual motivations for tall tales. My mother, too, is as level-headed as they come. Yet they both describe the same uncanny figure, separated by decades and hundreds of miles, as if he stepped right out of one memory and into another. If I ever do see him, I'm not sure what I'll do. Would I run, or would I stand there, pinned by that grin, until he quietly left? Sometimes at night, I imagine a silent black car pulling into my own driveway. I picture a tall figure stepping out, too clean, too perfect, tinted windows reflecting the streetlights. I wonder if he'd ask me the same questions. Have you seen anything unusual? Heard anything? Felt anything? And then what? Maybe I'd say, yes, my whole family has, and watch the grin fade from his face as he disappeared into the night. Or maybe I'd never get the chance. Perhaps he'd sense me, sense my father's blood in my veins, and leave before I could utter a single word. Either way, the thought leaves me uneasy, because a piece of me thinks it's only a matter of time before the same unmarked car finds me. After all, it found both my parents, across the span of 30 years. Maybe there's a pattern I just can't see, and maybe it's too big to comprehend. In the meantime, I live my life, run my errands, lock my doors, and keep an eye out whenever I see a flicker of gold hair in a crowd, waiting for the day that question might finally land on my doorstep. And if it ever does, I don't know that I'll have any better answers than my dad did back then. All I can hope is that when the grin fades, whoever, or whatever, lurks behind that perfect face will leave me be, just as it left him. Redditor 2. I've kept this story locked away for 23 years, sharing it only in whispered conversations with family. Even now, my hands tremble as I type these words. Some truths feel safer buried, but the weight of silence has become unbearable. I'm omitting certain details, dates, locations, names, not out of forgetfulness, but fear. Fear that somehow they're still watching. It happened the summer before 8th grade when the air hung thick with humidity and possibility. My best friends, Jake and Marcus, had this brilliant idea to sneak out at midnight. There were these girls from the next block over having a sleepover. Lisa liked Jake, or at least that's what we'd heard through the middle school grapevine. The plan was simple. Walk by their house, maybe throw some pebbles at their window, act cool. You know, typical 13-year-old stuff. The streetlights cast orange pools on the sidewalk as we crept through our sleeping neighborhood. The crickets seemed louder than usual that night, their chirping almost drowning out our whispered conversation. We turned onto Maple Street, not its real name, and that's when everything changed. At first, I thought it was a cloud, a weird shadow cast by the moon. But clouds don't hover motionless at rooftop height. Clouds don't gleam like polished gunmetal under starlight. What we saw defied explanation. A massive, black, blimp-shaped craft, suspended in the air, completely silent. Picture the Hindenburg, then multiply its size by 3 or 4. This thing was enormous, stretching across at least 4 football fields, maybe 5. The surface wasn't just black. It absorbed light like a void, except where occasional starlight caught its curved hull, revealing that metallic sheen. You guys see that, right? Jake's voice cracked. We all nodded, frozen in place. What the hell is it? Marcus whispered, but none of us had an answer. Here's where things get hazy, where my memory starts to feel like Swiss cheese. I remember staring up at it, my neck craning, heart pounding against my ribs. Then, nothing. A gap, like someone took scissors to a film reel and cut out a chunk of time. The next clear memory, the massive craft, was gone. In its place, a small glowing object shaped like a barbell drifted downward, trailing wisps of luminescent smoke. The sight was almost beautiful in a terrifying way. Then came the trucks, two of them, black as the craft had been, with silver equipment boxes mounted in their beds. They tore down our residential street doing at least 70, their engines roaring through the quiet night. Government, military, something else entirely, we never found out. By the time we stumbled back to Jake's house, the sky was turning pink with dawn. 5, maybe 6 hours had vanished. We made a pact to tell my dad. He worked for the city and would know what to do. But when morning came, the words wouldn't come. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The more we reached for the memory, the more it slipped away. Years passed. Marcus moved away junior year, and I lost touch with Jake after high school. When Facebook came around, we reconnected, but there was this unspoken barrier between us. We'd comment on each other's posts, like photos of each other's kids, but we never mentioned that night. It was like a wall we both saw, but pretended wasn't there. What haunts me most isn't the craft itself, though God knows that image is seared into my brain. It's the silence that followed. We lived in a major suburban area, hundreds of houses, thousands of people. That thing was massive, hovering right above a residential neighborhood just after midnight on a summer weekend. Someone else had to have seen it. But there was nothing. No news reports, no local paper coverage, no chatter at school, nothing on the early internet forums, just silence. Sometimes I wonder if we're all carrying around pieces of that night, hundreds of people bound together by a shared amnesia. Did others see it too, but, like us, found themselves unable or unwilling to speak about it? Are there others out there right now staring at their computer screens, wanting to share their story, but afraid of what might happen if they do? I've considered hypnosis over the years. There's a therapist in town who specializes in regression therapy, but something holds me back. What if what I remember is better than what actually happened? What if those missing hours contain something worse than my imagination can conjure? And how could I trust a stranger with this when I can barely trust myself with the memory? Last week, I ran into Jake at the grocery store. Our kids go to the same school now, and we made small talk about PTA meetings and soccer practice. But there was this moment, just before we parted ways, when he glanced up at the sky. A reflexive gesture, probably, but I knew what he was thinking about. I saw it in his eyes, the same fear, the same questions, the same memories trying to claw their way to the surface. I'm writing this now because I need to know if there are others, not just Jake and Marcus, but anyone who saw what we saw that night. Anyone who's been carrying this weight for all these years. Anyone who looks up at the night sky and feels that same mix of wonder and terror. Because here's what I know for certain, that craft was real. Those trucks were real. And somewhere out there, someone else remembers. They have to, don't they? Some nights, when I can't sleep, I go out to my backyard and look up at the stars. The crickets still chirp their summer songs, but now they sound like a warning. I stand there, watching, waiting, wondering if tonight will be the night it returns. And in those moments, I understand why we've all kept quiet for so long. But I can't stay silent anymore. This happened. It was real. And if you're out there, if you saw it too, know that you're not alone. Just be careful who you tell. Some truths come with a price, and I'm still not sure what ours might be. Redditor 3. Mom only talks about that night after her third glass of wine. Even then, her voice drops to a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon them back. I've heard the story enough times to piece it together, but each retelling reveals new details, like a photograph slowly developing in darkroom fluid. It was 1978, one of those sticky July nights when the air feels like molasses. Mom, 16 then, and her best friend Lisa were sprawled on the flat portion of Lisa's roof, sharing cigarettes and dreams about escaping their small town. The shingles were still warm from the day's sun, and stars crowded the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. We used to do that all the time, Mom told me once. Climb out Lisa's bedroom window, past her mom's wilting geraniums, just to feel like we were somewhere else. Anywhere else. The light appeared without warning. Not a plane, not a satellite, something else. Mom describes it as liquid brightness, whatever that means. Then nothing. A void where memories should be. When awareness returned, The moon had shifted positions dramatically. What felt like 15 minutes had been 3 hours. The cigarettes had burned down to filters. Their legs were stiff, and dew had settled on their clothes. Lisa just shut down after that, Mom says, swirling her wine glass. Like someone had pulled a curtain across her mind. Every time I tried to talk about it, she'd go blank. I don't know, she'd say, or just drop it, Karen. Then her eyes would get this faraway look, like she was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Mom moved away that fall. Her father got transferred to another state, and in the pre-internet era, maintaining long-distance friendships wasn't easy. Lisa became a memory, filed away with other teenage relics like mood rings and disco records. 10 years passed before they met again. Mom had flown back for her high school reunion, expecting to swap stories about marriages, careers, children. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a stranger, wearing her best friend's face. Lisa looked the same, mostly. Same honey blonde hair, same heart-shaped face. But there was something different in her eyes, a dreamy softness, an otherworldly peace that made Mom's skin crawl. She smiled constantly, but it never quite reached those changed eyes. I remember everything now, Lisa said over coffee, unprompted. Her voice had a musical quality it hadn't possessed in youth. It was confusing at first, just fragments and feelings, but they helped me understand. They helped me see. Mom's coffee went cold as Lisa spoke. The abductions, 4 in total, the initial terror of paralysis, of cold metal and probing lights. But then, the conversations, the knowledge. They didn't speak, not with words, but Lisa understood them. They showed her truths about space, about Earth, about time itself. They knew, Lisa said, stirring her untouched tea. They knew I would lose my baby in 1992. They tried to prevent it, but some things are written in deeper ways than they can change. Her serenity never wavered, even discussing her stillborn child. They took you again too, you know, after that first time. Mom denies this vehemently, but the nightmares tell a different story. She wakes up screaming sometimes, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced she can feel cold metal against her skin. Dad used to try to wake her during these episodes, but he stopped after she gave him a black eye, fighting against restraints that weren't there. You'll understand eventually, Lisa said that day, reaching across the table to pat Mom's hand. When you're ready to see the truth, it will be beautiful. They've met a few times since then, at weddings and funerals. Lisa lives a surprisingly normal life. Dental hygienist, book club member, garden enthusiast. She doesn't collect alien memorabilia or attend UFO conventions. The only hint of strangeness is that eternal, unsettling serenity. Last Christmas, Mom got a card from Lisa. Inside, beneath the generic holiday wishes, was a single sentence. They say, it's almost time. Mom didn't sleep for 3 days after receiving it. When she finally crashed, the nightmares came back worse than ever. She says she remembered new details this time. Figures with 2 long fingers, eyes like liquid mercury, a humming sound that made her bones vibrate. But the worst part wasn't what she remembered. It was the feeling that accompanied the memories, a sense of recognition, of familiarity. Yesterday, Mom called me in tears. She'd been gardening when she found herself staring at the sky, overwhelmed by a sudden feeling of peace. For just a moment, she said, everything made sense. The truth was right there, beautiful and terrible and perfect. Then, the moment passed, leaving her terrified, not of what she'd felt, but of how much she wanted to feel it again. I'm writing this down now because Mom's starting to get that same dreamy look in her eyes. Her nightmares have stopped. Sometimes I catch her staring at the stars, smiling that same serene smile I remember from Lisa's photos. She says she's sleeping better than she has in years, but last night, I had a dream about a liquid light in the sky. When I woke up, I couldn't remember the last 3 hours before bed. And this morning, Mom left a note on my pillow. Don't be afraid when they come. The truth is beautiful. I haven't told her yet, but I'm starting to understand what she means. Redditor 4. Everyone has a breaking point when driving alone at night. That moment when the darkness starts playing tricks on your mind. For me, it came at exactly 10:53 p.m. on a stretch of 2-lane highway, so rural that the cornstalks seemed to whisper as you passed. I know the precise time because I checked my phone when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror, thinking I should note when the traffic stop began. The lights strobed red and blue against my side mirrors. Standard police lights, or so I thought. I did what any good Midwestern kid would do, signaled right, turned onto the first side road I saw, and reached for my glove compartment. Insurance, registration, license. The routine was muscle memory by then, drilled into me by my father since I got my permit. But the lights vanished. No cruiser passed by, no flashlight beam cut through my back window. 10:56 p.m. I remember checking my phone again because what happened next made me think I needed to call roadside assistance. My car's electrical system went haywire, like something out of a carnival-haunted house. The radio cycled through stations, volume climbing and dropping, like someone was playing with the dial. The dome light flickered in sync with my headlights, creating a stuttering strobe effect that made the cornfields dance. I figured it was just car trouble. God knows my 2008 Civic had seen better days. I leaned down to pull the hood release, thinking I'd check the battery connections. That's where the film of my memory snaps, like an old projector eating the reel. The next frame, stars. So many stars. I'd grown up in Indiana, spent countless nights stargazing with my uncle at his farm, but I'd never seen them like this. They seemed closer somehow, more interested in what was happening below. The cold bit through my jacket as I lay there, trying to process why I was looking at stars instead of my car's hood. I sat up slowly, my joints creaking like I'd been still for hours. Corn stalks, cut to stubble after the harvest, surrounded me in every direction. No car, no road, no lights, except those impossibly bright stars and distant headlights that seemed to float in the darkness. The panic didn't hit all at once. It built slowly, like a wave gathering strength. Where was my car? Why was I in a field? What happened to the time between reaching for the hood release and now? My hands shook as I patted my pockets. Phone, wallet, keys, all gone. I oriented myself using the distant headlights and started walking. The stubble crunched under my feet, each step sending small jolts of pain through my legs like I'd been running. But I hadn't been running, had I? The road signs emerged from the darkness, 350th and 50 West. I was half a mile from where I'd pulled over, half a mile through fields I'd never walked through, to end up lying in the middle of harvested corn, like some twisted crop circle punchline. My car appeared exactly where I'd left it, a darker shadow against the night. The battery was dead, every electrical system drained to nothing. My phone sat innocently on the passenger seat, display showing 2:17 a.m. 3 hours and 21 minutes. Gone. Vanished like the mysterious lights that had started this whole nightmare. I sat there for 30 minutes, just breathing, trying to make the math work. How does someone walk half a mile in 3 hours? Why couldn't I remember a single step of that journey? Why did my legs feel like I'd run a marathon? The questions piled up like the corn stubble against the field's edge, but no answers emerged from the darkness. When I finally remembered to call Dapiaolae, the operator's voice was the first human sound I'd heard in 3 hours or longer. Time had become slippery, unreliable. The wait for the tow truck stretched like taffy, each minute expanding to hold my racing thoughts. I've only told my uncle this story. He's the one who taught me about the stars, who showed me how to navigate by Polaris and track the seasons by Orion's movement across the sky. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long time. "The thing about the night sky," he finally said, "is that it's been watching us a lot longer than we've been watching it. I still drive that route sometimes when I visit home from college. I've timed it. At normal walking speed, it takes about 10 minutes to cover half a mile through those fields. I've looked for signs, for broken stalks, or strange marks that might explain my journey. I've never found anything. But sometimes, when I pass that spot at night, my car's electronics flutter for just a moment. The radio skips, the lights flicker, and in my rearview mirror, I catch a glimpse of something bright. I don't pull over anymore. Some questions are better left in the dark, buried in those missing 3 hours with all the other things we can't explain. My uncle says I should be grateful I only lost time. He's worked his farm for 40 years and has seen things in those fields that don't fit into any rational explanation. The stars, he tells me, they don't just watch. Sometimes they come down to take a closer look. I keep a journal now, noting the exact time whenever I drive at night. So far, I haven't lost any more hours. But sometimes, in my dreams, I see those stars again, so close, so bright, so interested in what's happening below. And I wake up with the unsettling feeling that somewhere, in that gap between 10:56 p.m. and 2:17 a.m., I learned something I wasn't supposed to know. I just can't remember what it was. Redditor 5. The first time it happened, I blamed my dad's obsession with ancient aliens. We'd spent that Sunday like we spent most Sundays. Him in his worn leather recliner, me sprawled on the couch, watching wide-eyed experts discuss mysterious lights and crop circles. By bedtime, my head was full of flying saucers and little green men. But what came at 3:17 a.m. wasn't little, and it certainly wasn't green. The blue light came first, pulsing through my blinds like silent lightning. I tried to roll over, to pull my blanket over my head, but my body wouldn't respond. Completely paralyzed, I could only stare at my ceiling as the light intensified, becoming a harsh, sterile white that burned my retinas. The pressure started in my chest, like someone had threaded a hook through my sternum and was slowly, inexorably pulling upward. My body began to rise, arms splayed out, chest thrust forward in an awkward arch. A mechanical whirring filled my ears, drowning out my racing heartbeat. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't even close my eyes against that searing light. When I finally broke free, I found myself sitting up in bed, arms locked behind me, chest still thrust forward like a sacrifice on some ancient altar. My throat was raw, though I hadn't made a sound. Sweat had soaked through my sheets, but my skin was ice cold. Just sleep paralysis, I told myself, even as my hands shook making coffee that morning. Just my brain misfiring during REM sleep. I'd read about it online, how your mind wakes up before your body, leaving you trapped between sleeping and waking. How your brain, desperate to make sense of the paralysis, conjures up explanations, demons, ghosts, aliens. But knowing the science doesn't help when it happens again and again. The worst episode came 6 months later. I was driving home from a late shift at work, the kind of tired where your eyes burn and every blink feels like it might last forever. I pulled into a parking garage. Just for a minute, I told myself, just to rest my eyes. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly yellow glow, making the concrete pillars look diseased. When I tried to get out of the car, my legs wouldn't work. The paralysis crept up from my feet, through my legs, into my chest. I couldn't even reach for my phone. That's when the whispers started. They came from just behind my left ear, so close I should have felt breath on my skin. But there was no breath. No warmth, just words, horrible words, things that made me think of ancient succubi, of centuries of folklore about demons that visit in the night. The voice knew things about me, things I'd never told anyone. It knew my fears, my desires, my secrets. My grandmother would have called it a demon. The UFO shows my dad watches would call it an alien. My doctor calls it a parasomnia, writes prescriptions for sleep medication, and recommends meditation apps. But here's the thing they don't tell you about sleep paralysis. Sometimes things change in the real world. Sometimes you wake up with marks on your body that weren't there before. Sometimes your sheets are disturbed in ways that don't match how you fell asleep. Sometimes your car's mileage doesn't add up, or you find yourself parked in slightly different spots than you remember. Last night, it happened again. The blue lights, the paralysis, the mechanical whirring. But this time, something was different. This time, I heard words through the whirring, not the twisted whispers from the parking garage, but something clearer, something that sounded like instructions. And this time, when I woke up, I found coordinates written on my forearm in handwriting that wasn't mine. I haven't decided if I'm going to follow them. Part of me wants to dismiss it all as another episode, another misfiring of neurons during REM sleep. That's the rational explanation, right? The safe explanation. But another part of me, the part that still watches alien shows with my dad every Sunday, wonders if there's something more. What if sleep paralysis isn't just a glitch in our brains? What if it's a mechanism, a way for something else to reach through the veil between worlds and touch us? What if those ancient stories about demons and modern tales of alien abduction are just different ways of describing the same thing? I don't know which possibility terrifies me more, that these experiences are real, that something out there is watching us, reaching for us in the dark, or that our own minds can conjure such vivid horrors that we're all just one misfiring neuron away from being trapped in our personal nightmare. The coordinates are still on my arm. I could wash them off, take another sleeping pill, pretend this is all just another episode. But I know I won't. Because the voice last night, the one through the mechanical whirring, said something else too. It said this was the last time, that next time I wouldn't just be visiting them. Next time, I'd be joining them. Maybe I'll ask my dad to come with me when I follow those coordinates. After all, he's the one who got me interested in aliens in the first place. But something tells me that what we'll find there won't be anything like what we've seen on TV. The sun is setting now, and I can feel my eyelids getting heavy. I should be terrified of falling asleep, but instead, I feel a strange sense of anticipation. Because now I know the truth. It's not about what's real and what isn't. It's about what happens in that space between sleeping and waking, between reality and dreams, between what we think we know and what's really out there, watching us sleep. I just hope I remember to scream this time. Redditor 6. Wildland firefighters learn to read smoke like sailors read the sea. Different colors, different densities. They all tell a story. But nothing in my 12 years of fighting fires prepared me for what we saw that day near Dugway. It started routinely enough. 4 Type 6 engines in convoy formation, heading toward a relatively small brush fire on the southern edge of the proving grounds. Utah's summer heat had turned the sage to kindling, and we'd been chasing lightning strikes all season. Standard stuff. The choppers appeared around 0900, 8 black military birds, flying in perfect formation, like ravens escorting a funeral procession. They matched our speed exactly, maintaining position above and around us for nearly 10 miles. Just some hotshots showing off, Martinez radioed from the lead engine. Bet they're bored out here in the desert. But something felt off. Military choppers usually thundered. These moved with an unsettling quietness, like shadows with rotors. When they finally peeled away, the silence felt heavier than before. We parked the rigs at our designated staging area, prep checking our gear for the hike in. Normal procedure: check your fire shelter, check your radio, check your water. The fire didn't look like much from our position, just a thin column of smoke about 2 miles out, probably from a lightning strike the night before. That's when everything went sideways. The smoke column suddenly transformed, shooting straight up like God himself had thrown a punch through the earth. 200 feet minimum, maybe more. The concussion hit us seconds later, strong enough to rock the engines. The sound came last, not the familiar roar of an explosion, but something deeper, like the ground itself was groaning. "What the hell was that?" someone asked over the radio. No one answered. 5 minutes later, we saw it. The aircraft, if you could call it that, emerged from the disturbed smoke column, flying low enough that we could see every detail. It was like something out of a sci-fi movie. Flat black, rectangular, but with organic curves, like a manta ray designed by stealth engineers. The underside housed what looked like propulsion wells, but there was no visible exhaust, no sound at all. It moved with impossible slowness, maybe 80 knots, defying every law of aerodynamics I knew. Engine 47. This is restricted area control. The voice cut through our radio chatter, crisp and professional. You are instructed to evacuate the area immediately. Confirm receipt. Our crew chief, Thompson, keyed his mic. Or AC, this is Engine 47. Can we get a reason for the evacuation order? Silence. Then our incident commander's voice. All units, this is IC. We are evacuating the area effective immediately. New assignment incoming. They sent us to a mop-up operation near Cedar City, 100 miles south. The fire there was already contained. Just some smoldering stumps and hot spots that needed babysitting. Make work, obviously, but no one complained. We'd all seen enough that day. Later, over beers at our regular bar in Salt Lake, we tried to make sense of it. Why hadn't they kept us out of the area in the first place? The proving grounds had plenty of restricted zones. They could have easily declared a temporary closure for testing. Maybe they didn't plan it, Martinez suggested. Maybe something went wrong and they had to test whatever that thing was right then. Or maybe they wanted witnesses, Thompson said quietly. We all looked at him. Think about it. Best way to hide something is to make it look like you're trying to hide something else. That was 3 years ago. I've fought dozens of fires since then, but but I still think about that day, about the black helicopters that moved like shadows, about the aircraft that ignored physics, about the smoke that reached for the sky like a finger pointing at something we weren't supposed to see. Last month, I ran into Williams, one of the other crew chiefs from that day. He'd transferred to a hotshot crew in California, but something had brought him back to Utah. We got to talking about old times, old fires. When I mentioned Dugway, his face changed. "You know what's weird?" he said, leaning in close. I looked up our incident report from that day. It's gone. Not redacted, not classified, just gone, like it never happened. "What about the Cedar City fire?" I asked. "The mop-up operation they sent us to?" He shook his head. "No record of us being there either. According to official logs, our engines were in maintenance that whole week." I dream about that smoke column sometimes. In the dreams, it's not reaching up, but reaching down, like something underneath was trying to break through. And sometimes, just before I wake up, I hear that voice on the radio again, not telling us to leave, but warning us about what's coming. They say smoke tells a story, but sometimes, I think, the story it tells isn't meant for us to understand. Last week, I saw another column of smoke like that one, way out in the desert, but when I called it in, dispatch had no record of any fires in the area, and as I watched, 8 black helicopters flew past, heading toward the smoke, silent as death. I turned my engine around and drove away. Some fires, you learn, are better left burning. Redditor. 7. Some memories fade like old photographs, their edges growing soft and colors washing out, until you're not sure if you're remembering the event or just remembering the last time you remembered it. But certain moments stay razor sharp, permanently etched into your mind with a clarity that defies time. For me, that moment came on a warm Tuesday afternoon in September 1997. I can tell you every detail about that day, not because I've rehearsed the story, though I have, countless times, but because it's burned into my memory like a brand. The temperature was 78 degrees. I remember checking the car's digital display. The sky was that particular shade of autumn blue that makes you think you can see straight into space. Mom was wearing her favorite green blouse with pearl buttons, and I had on my University of Michigan sweatshirt despite the warmth. We were driving back from Aunt Sarah's house in Toledo, where we'd gone to help her sort through Grandma's things after the funeral. The radio was playing softly, some adult contemporary station Mom liked, and we were discussing whether to stop for dinner or wait until we got home. Normal conversation, normal day, until it wasn't. It appeared without warning, without sound, without any of the dramatic buildup you'd expect from such a world-shifting moment. One instant, the sky was empty, and the next, it wasn't. The object hung there, slightly to our left, at what I'd estimate was about 2,000 feet altitude. The sun caught its surface and transformed it into something almost too bright to look at, like a second sun had descended from the heavens. "Do you see that?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper. Her knuckles had gone white on the steering wheel. "Yeah," I managed to reply. "Yeah, I see it." The classic flying saucer shape feels almost cliché to describe now, like I'm reciting from some 1950s sci-fi movie. But that's exactly what it was. A massive disc, maybe 300 feet in diameter, with a raised dome in the center. The surface appeared metallic, but it reflected light in a way that seemed wrong somehow, as if the reflections were half a second delayed. We drove on for maybe 20 seconds, both of us staring up through the windshield. Traffic was light on that stretch of highway, thankfully, because Mom's attention was definitely not on the road. The object remained perfectly stationary, defying both gravity and common sense. Then it happened. In movies, there's always a flash of light, a boom, some sort of special effect to mark a dramatic moment. But this was different. The craft simply ceased to exist. Not gradually, not with a fade out or a zoom into the distance. One moment it was there, solid as a mountain and just as undeniable, and the next, nothing. As if reality itself had hiccuped and erased it from existence. I turned to Mom, my mouth open to speak, but the words died in my throat. Her face had gone pale, and there were tears in her eyes. Not tears of fear, I realized, but the kind that come when you've seen something so profound it breaks through all your emotional defenses. Did that just... "Yeah," she nodded, completing my unfinished question. It did. We drove the rest of the way home in near silence, both lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we were sitting in our driveway, engine off, but neither of us making a move to get out, that Mom finally spoke again. "We can't tell your father," she said. "He'll think we've lost our minds." But we did tell him, eventually, and my sister, and my best friend, and anyone else who would listen. Some laughed it off. Others nodded politely while their eyes glazed over. A few even shared their own stories, speaking in hushed tones about lights in the sky, or lost time, or strange memories they couldn't quite explain. That was 27 years ago. I'm married now, with kids of my own. My career in architectural design has nothing to do with astronomical phenomena or unexplained events. But that moment has colored everything that came after it. How could it not? When you see something that completely rewrites your understanding of what's possible, you can't simply file it away and move on. Mom and I still talk about it, usually late at night over phone calls when we can't sleep. We've analyzed every second of those few minutes, comparing our memories, making sure they haven't shifted or changed with time. They haven't. Every detail matches, down to the way the light played across the craft's surface and the absolute silence of its disappearance. I've read every book I could find on UFO phenomena. I've attended conferences, secretly, telling my wife they were work-related. I've spent countless hours on online forums, looking for someone else who might have seen what we saw that day. The search has led me down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and government cover-ups, of ancient astronaut hypotheses and quantum physics theories about interdimensional travel. But none of it quite captures what it felt like to be there on that ordinary afternoon when the impossible inserted itself into our reality for 23 seconds. Last month, Mom called me at 3 in the morning. She'd been watching the sunset at her Florida retirement community when she saw something in the sky. Not the same craft. This was just a light that moved in ways lights shouldn't be able to move, but it brought her right back to that day in 1997. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if they were looking for something or someone?" I didn't have an answer then, and I don't have one now, but I do know this. Somewhere out there, perhaps in this dimension or another, that craft still exists. And maybe, just maybe, they're still watching, still appearing and disappearing, still challenging other unsuspecting travelers to question everything they think they know about reality. The sun still catches metal objects sometimes, planes, satellites, weather balloons, and makes them shine in that particular way. And every time, just for a moment, I hold my breath and wait to see if they'll vanish. So far, they never have. But I keep watching the skies, just in case. Because once you've seen the impossible, you can never quite stop looking for it to happen again. Redditor 8. I've never told anyone this before, but I've always believed those strange rumors about cement container sightings, those bizarre stories about silent shapes lurking in the night sky, looking like massive tanks or containers drifting above the ground. Most people say it's just a fever dream or a trick of the eyes, but I grew up convinced there was something out there. I can't explain why I believed. Perhaps it was a half-remembered story my grandfather told me, or maybe just a bone-deep intuition that we're not alone. Either way, I had the sort of half-faith that made me scan the horizon whenever I was alone outside. But what happened one night years ago solidified everything for me. I was standing outside behind my uncle's old farmhouse, a place way out in the country where there were no streetlights for miles, no neighbors closer than a 10-minute drive, and no city glow to break the darkness. It was near midnight, maybe just a bit before. I remember I could still see the faint silhouette of tree lines against a star-studded sky. I'd stepped out for some cool air and a moment of quiet, hoping to catch sight of a shooting star. It wasn't unusual for me to see satellites drifting overhead. I could pick them out, faint and steady, crossing from one horizon to another. But that evening, as I looked up at the infinite scatter of lights, I caught sight of something moving from right to left. At first, I assumed it was just another satellite. I didn't think twice about it. It cruised across the sky with that slow, consistent pace satellites always have. Then, as I tracked it with my eyes, it froze, like it had run into an invisible wall. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked hard, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks. But it hadn't vanished. It was just suspended up there, a tiny speck among the constellations. A few seconds later, it shot off at a sharp angle, maybe 45 degrees or so, traveling in a direction that no normal satellite could manage. It disappeared in the blink of an eye, almost like someone had flicked off a switch. I remember standing there, heart rattling in my ribcage, wondering if I should be excited, terrified, or just plain confused. For a minute, I convinced myself I must have imagined it. The night was so clear, the sky so cold, that maybe my eyes were spasming or something. But the more I stood there, feeling the damp grass under my shoes and the chill creeping into my fingers, the more certain I became that I'd seen something impossible. I stared at the sky, scanning the same area in hopes it would come back, but the stars just twinkled, oblivious to my confusion. My mind churned. Satellites don't just stop and change direction. They don't freeze mid-path and shoot off with unnatural speed. I'd seen plenty of them in my lifetime, plus the occasional plane with blinking lights. Nothing I knew could do what I'd just witnessed. I was alone, which didn't help. Everyone else was asleep inside, windows dark, doors locked. It was that hour of the night when even the farmhouse felt abandoned. The only sound was a distant breeze rustling the leaves of an old oak tree. It's a cliché, but in that quiet, every little noise seems amplified. My own heartbeat pulsed in my eardrums, and the gentle hum of the fridge inside the house became a steady drone through the walls. I wanted to wake someone up to say, "Look, you have to see this." But how could I make them see? That moment had come and gone. Whatever I'd seen was long vanished, and no one would believe me if I only had my word to show for it. I felt so isolated that I half suspected I'd dreamt it all. Still, I was certain it was real. I tried rationalizing. Maybe it had been a meteor. Sometimes they can streak in at steep angles, skip off the atmosphere like a flat rock on a pond, and shoot away again. Maybe that accounted for the sudden shift in trajectory. But the actual sight of it stopping mid-flight, that was harder to explain with science. Meteors don't usually pause and then zip away in the complete opposite direction. People talk about optical illusions, lens flares, or something about how our eyes track bright objects at night. But illusions can't quite replicate that moment when the thing halted. I even remembered seeing a faint flash, as though it had gathered some energy or signaled something. Then, in the heartbeat between 1 second and the next, it shot off and vanished. I found myself staring at the moonless sky, noticing just how unsettling true darkness can be. In the city, or even in a small town, we forget what genuine blackness looks like. Out here, your eyes see shadows everywhere. The silhouettes of the barn and the farmland fence seemed to shift if I looked at them from the corner of my eye. A sinking feeling roiled in my stomach. My sense of safety drifted away, replaced by a tingling awareness that maybe something watched me from out there, above the tall grass, behind the orchard trees, or in the sky itself. The ordinary farmland, once comforting, now felt vast and indifferent. I heard a rustle near the field, probably a fox or an opossum, but it made me jump. I checked my phone only to see the battery was at 6%, the screen flickering in the cold. There was no chance of capturing anything if it happened again, not that a phone camera in near-complete darkness would have helped. The air smelled faintly of hay and damp earth, and the breeze carried a softness that belied the creeping terror in my mind. As minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly missed something bigger. It's as if the sky had parted, showed me a tiny secret, and then snapped shut. I started to wonder about those cement container stories I'd heard in passing. Talk about odd shapes that people glimpse above highways or farm fields, shapes that defy all logic, sometimes floating, sometimes vanishing. Back when I was a kid, I used to read about them, always half hoping I'd see one for real. Now that I'd witnessed something truly weird, I wasn't sure if I was relieved or horrified. Eventually, I forced myself back inside. The hallway lights felt too bright. The house smelled like the leftover soup my aunt had made. My family was snoring behind closed doors. I couldn't sleep. I kept revisiting that moment, the suspended object, the abrupt angle, the disappearance. Over and over, I pictured it freezing midair. The more I replayed it in my head, the more goosebumps prickled along my arms. I flipped on the television, channel surfed through an old documentary about UFO sightings. People called in to radio shows, describing how they'd seen lights that made impossible maneuvers. Each story sounded too outlandish to be real, but now my mind was open. Had I just joined the ranks of believers? Or was there still some prosaic explanation that I couldn't see? The next day, I went online and tried to research skipping meteors, reading how a really steep angle of approach can cause a celestial rock to bounce off Earth's atmosphere. Some people reported seeing them flash, change direction abruptly, and then fade away. But something about that explanation just didn't settle right with me. The speed and precision of the turn. It felt purposeful, like it was reacting to something, not just physics. And that pause, none of the articles I found mentioned a meteor pausing. The phenomenon was always described as a continuous motion. Mine felt different. No matter how many logs or scientific papers I looked up, I couldn't replicate that image in my mind with something normal. I kept coming back to a creeping suspicion that I'd seen something unexplainable. A few weeks later, I tried telling a friend about it in the gentlest, least wild-sounding way. He just shrugged, telling me I was overreacting, and maybe I was tired, or I'd had a stray reflection off my glasses. I didn't wear glasses that night, but I didn't push the point. I could see the skepticism in his eyes. People want to believe in a neat, rational explanation. I used to be one of those people, eager to settle on the simplest answer and move on. But after that night, I realized how quick we are to dismiss anomalies. Maybe we do it to protect ourselves from the uncomfortable idea that we don't control everything, that we don't know half of what's out there. As time went on, I found myself noticing small details in the night. Lights that flickered in corners of the sky where there shouldn't have been any. Strange sensations, like the hair on the back of my neck lifting even when there was no breeze. Once, late in the fall, I thought I saw a shadow pass over me, even though the full moon was behind a cloud. It was just a flicker, but enough to make my stomach lurch. I couldn't prove any of it. I wasn't sure if I was just spooking myself, letting my imagination run wild. That's the problem with experiences like this. You start questioning every corner of darkness, every flicker of light. You become half certain that there's a pattern, that maybe these sightings are connected to something bigger. You start dreaming about it too, huge shapes drifting silently above me, like overturned cement containers, humming with an otherworldly resonance. I'd jolt awake, sweating and tangled in my sheets, certain I could still hear that hum. I've tried to let it go, but it lingers in the corners of my mind. Sometimes I recall that hush over the farmland, the way the sky seemed to hold its breath when that object stopped. I wonder if it saw me, or sensed me watching it. In those stories about cement containers, people sometimes say they feel singled out by whatever's inside. They wake up with the unshakable conviction that something has observed them, studied them, then vanished just as quickly. I don't know if that's the truth, but I do know that moment changed me. I can't look at the night sky in the same way anymore. There's always the possibility that I'll see it again, or see something else that defies explanation. I never found proof. No photos, no videos, no eyewitness accounts. My family still sleeps soundly in that farmhouse, unaware that, in my mind, the farmland is host to an uncanny memory. There's a spot behind the barn where the grass grows a bit higher, where I like to stand alone when I visit. I glance upward, letting the dark fill my vision, hoping for a sign or dreading one, I'm not sure which. The night doesn't answer, only the insects chirping and the breeze whispering against the eaves. But sometimes, if I stare long enough, I think I catch a subtle flicker of movement among the stars. Nothing big or dramatic, just the faint impression that something is there, scanning, watching, or passing by. The rational part of me says it's just a stray satellite, or my eyes adjusting to the faint glow of starlight. Yet deep down, that same old tension twists in my gut. And I remember that night vividly, the quick flash, the unnatural angle, and the sense that I'd stumbled onto something not meant for human eyes. My friend can shrug all he wants. Scientists can talk about bouncing meteors all day, but I know what I witnessed. And sometimes, alone in the dark, I feel as though it witnessed me right back, 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 witnessed me right